Keep watching The Politics every Friday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time on New York Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.
Hello, welcome to Parrot TV's The Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering, and I'm hosting with Billy Bob Ben Toth and CARLO PARCELLI. Special guest today. Again, we have Regis Tremblay. We're going to discuss the possibility of war in the Crimea. We'll get to Samantha Powers' visit to Hungary with Ben Toth, and a little bit about China later on with Regis Tremblay's opinions on that. So I'm going to kick it over to Ben with a question for Regis. So let's get this thing started. Let's get Ben on the line here.
Undoubtedly, Africa is the best tourism destination on Earth. The continent is blessed with the most conducive atmosphere. To feel and enjoy these blessings, join the most productive one-week tour of the continent organized by Daylight Africa every September 2nd to September 9th to see beyond the fallacies about Africa on the mainstream media. Contact us at daylightafrica@gmail.com or call 718-822-5555. Daylight Africa. Revolutionizing tourism industries in Africa.
That was a good ad placement, by the way.
That was a very sharp ad placement. I was not expecting that. It just popped up, and then that's quite all right. So let's go back to Ben, and Ben, go ahead and jump in with your question for Regis.
We can talk about Africa later because it can be relevant, because Lavrov just signed off on the first Russian base being built in the Sudan. But to Regis Tremblay, who joins us from Yalta, where the big three, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met in 1945, just a week ago. So it was February, I think, 11, like just a week ago it ended, when Stalin was on the verge of victory and people paid attention when he was talking. That's where he comes from right now. He's sitting there. And just 5 days ago, Ukraine was begging, basically, advertising that they want, I forgot the land variant of the Typhoon missiles, 240 kilometers of range from the UK specifically to attack Crimea. There's been talk about the same 150 kilometer range ATACMS. Brian Beletic would know more about those from America. Well, mostly it's just been quieted down, maybe next year, maybe sometime. And just yesterday, Victoria Nuland, basically, her voice through Anthony Blinken came through on the British Telegram, warning Ukraine that not to attack Crimea because it's a red line for Putin. I thought all the red lines were gone, but I'm just want to ask Regis, are you worried? Are you trembling? Sorry, that's
Tremblay.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and greetings to you, CARLO and Billy Bob. Always great to be with you. No, I am not trembling. The people here in Crimea are not trembling. People are not worried. On the one hand, the United States has said they're not encouraging Ukraine to try to take back and use longer range missiles on Ukraine. But on the other hand, they said Ukraine is free to attack Russia wherever they want. Now, in terms of your question, I have to tell you that people here in Crimea are not worried. Somebody asked me if there was martial law in Crimea.
What's the mood like? What are your conversations like with people?
Well,
you live there. This is so rare.
The mood is life is going on as normal. The only thing that we saw 2 days ago, returning from Sevastopol, the large Russian Black Sea Fleet is based there in Sevastopol. When we were returning home, we had to go through a security clearance. There was an X-ray type of machine, 2 military personnel that were looking into our belongings. We had a couple of satchels. I had an old pair of shoes. I had just bought a new pair of shoes there. and they let us go through. And there were signs in the buses warning about terrorist operations.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody seemed concerned. As I said, people were going about their daily business, just like we always do. Now, in terms of the attacks on Crimea, there have been several. On January 16th, it was reported that the air defenses shot down a total of 10 Ukrainian UAVs within 24 hours.
This January.
Crimea and Yalta have not been hit by any of these attempts to attack Crimea. I want to add that Crimea, after the attack on the bridge at Kerch and after the pipelines were blown up, Crimea has become one of the most safest and well-defended places on the planet for two reasons, in my opinion. The first one is because of the large Russian naval base at Sevastopol. Russia is not going to allow that base to be attacked. Number two, Crimea is now part of the Russian Federation. Russia has made that clear. Crimea is Russia. The historical context is extremely important. It goes back to the time of Catherine the Great, at the time of the American Revolution, 1776, when Catherine the Great took Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. From that time, it has been part of Russia. It was Khrushchev,
Who gifted
a Ukrainian, who deeded Crimea to Ukraine during the Soviet Union. It was no big deal. It was all part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, Kiev, was going to administer Crimea. And for these past years, Crimea has been neglected by Ukraine. It's really important to emphasize again the referendum in 2014, where over 90% of the people of Crimea voted to return to Russia. There was no Russian invasion. There was nobody died. It was peaceful. The people here expressed their will, their desire for self-determination to return to Russia. And so these two reasons, the naval base in Sevastopol and Crimea being an integral part of the Russian Federation, are two reasons why we feel here protected and why life is going on as usual. There's no martial law. There's no chaos. There's no mass fear. We are going about life as we always have.
I have a question about fresh water. I know the Ukrainians cut off water to the northern Crimea. I know you're in Yalta is in the south of Crimea, but what can you tell us about the situation about fresh water now in northern Crimea?
Well, Carlo, thank you for that question. One of the first missions of the special operation was to resume the water flow from the Dnieper River, which the Ukrainians had blocked in 2014. So Crimea, since that time, has been flush with water. Last year, we had a really heavy snowfall. We've had a lot of rain since and a lot of rain this winter. The aquifers are full. The water reservoirs are absolutely filled. We bypassed them on the way to Sevastopol and Simferopol in the last couple of weeks. There's no shortage of water here, Carlo. And the Dnieper River, the canal that connects Ukraine to Ukraine, has been open since the beginning of the military operation.
That runs counter to a lot of reporting here in the West. So I just wanted to clear that up. Thank you very much.
Just out of curiosity, I hadn't prepared a clip or anything, but the cokehead of Kiev, Zelensky, I wonder if you saw him appear on Ukrainian television in 2015 before he was president, and he was mimicking being a Crimean person, and they gave him a glass of water, and he was just like all over it, a very disgusting mockery that people in Crimea didn't have water. I wonder if you've seen that one.
No, I haven't. I haven't seen that one.
Okay. Sorry, I don't have it in hand, but it's something that struck me based on the water question.
Well, should we move on now? I mean, do you have anything else to add, Regis? Because
the only thing that I would add is that Russia is not going to be provoked by anything the United States or Zelensky, Ukraine, does. They are going about their business on a day-to-day basis, grinding down the Ukrainian military operation. Most reports that I'm sure you have seen from both the United States, people like Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, and from people on the scene in Ukraine who are reporting on a daily basis, the Ukrainian army has been almost obliterated. The remaining forces there seem to be Poles, mercenaries from a variety of countries, including the United States and Canada, and they are running out of ammunition. And so I think the mood here is that the people are behind President Putin. They understand that this war, and it is a war in Ukraine,
now it is
about the survival of the Russian nation. They understand that, and they are behind their president and behind their military. I would like to make that very clear to anybody in your audience in the United States and the West that are listening. Russia is winning, and Russia will win this conflict, and Russia will determine the finalization. Russia will determine how this conflict ends, and it will not be at the peace table. It will be somewhat like General MacArthur accepting the unequivocal defeat of the Japanese country at the end of World War II. Russia will determine the end of this conflict.
Yeah, and on to the next question, which involves Hungary, and I like to get both Ben and your comments, Regis. Samantha Power, who heads the USAID, which is a synonym for the Central Intelligence Agency, just visited Hungary, and that means that a coup in Hungary to overthrow Orban is in the making. And I'd like to get Ben's opinion and your opinion, Regis, and anybody else that wants to jump in about that situation.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I think so, because you're on the ground.
I was researching this woman this week. It hasn't been the best of weeks. I had a lot of work, but this woman basically minted Obama's, I think, right to defend policy, meaning humanitarian invention. We are jumping in to defend people, that sort of stuff. Why it became policy. She's one of those women who worked up her way, becoming what she described as an idealist, becoming a realist, meaning idealism suited for the purpose of empire. And she has been intervention central. It's very much in the Nuland Kagan way of thinking, but the soft one. And the moment I saw, I think on Twitter, I'm in Budapest now, and we are going to bring more freedom and democracy. We are going to help independent media, and we are bringing Hungary into a brighter future. I was like, okay, that's pray for Hungary. We are not as secure as we'd like to be. We have emerged a very important country, by the way. Wang Yi is doing a tour of Europe. She's in Paris now. Oh, he's in Paris now. The head honcho in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and one of his stops is going to be Budapest, curiously. So it is an important nation, but this woman appearing when it's come out that our inflation is one of the highest in Europe, 25%, despite us receiving very cheap Russian gas to heat what I'm heating with right now, there's still a lot of trouble. But, you know, there's no revolts, there's no real protest, there's no move against the government. Most of the people, maybe begrudgingly, are with Orban on foreign policy, but it's you never know. I was very scared to see her appear here because America is mighty. I've seen their embassy in Budapest. It's not quite the fort that you have in Kiev, but it's a huge building, and that always correlates to operations within a country. So I'm worried. We have remained one of the last, next to Serbia, who haven't condemned Russia, who haven't gone along with all the sanctions, at least when it comes to energy, especially nuclear energy, that we depend on. And we might be looking at paying the price. So I'm worried. Should I be? What do you think, Regis?
Yeah. What do you think, Regis?
Well, I've obviously followed the news about your country's position in terms of this military operation in Ukraine. I know that Hungary, like Serbia, wants to be friendly, I think, with Russia. They depend on Russia, Russian energy, and Russian friendship for many, many, many years. I do agree that the United States, specifically the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros organization, are active in Serbia, in Hungary, in Moldova, in Georgia, in many other countries to try to keep them under the control of the United States. And so I think that, let's put it this way, I hope that the people in these countries who realize that their leaders, for the most part, have not been acting in their interest, will rise up against them, as we are seeing happening now in France.
Yes.
We're seeing happening in Italy. We're even seeing it happen in Germany.
East Germany mostly, yes.
That's correct. And I think this is the hope. This is what is hopeful for me, is that the people in these countries are not being represented by those people in the EU who are not their elected representatives, and their elected representatives who are under the control of other forces, the United States, the globalists, the World Economic Forum, etc.
You give me hope. By the way, just 2 points on that. While Orban is in power, and he is seen as the last sovereign in Europe, really acting for the interests of the people here, two people have fallen in the last couple of weeks. First was Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who thought news, media, disinformation are weapons. She resigned, and just last night, her equivalent in Scotland, I don't know if you've heard this, did a 55-minute recorded video of her resigning, and she was, well, the one about asking like 8-year-old children about sexual preferences and that sort of stuff that we won't talk anymore about. But they've fallen. Orban is still there. He's been there for 12 years. So you give me hope. I hope he can stay. But just so you know, the opposition is not like him. They are very well funded. I can tell you more about that another time, but they would go along with anything Brussels says.
You know, and another consideration is what's happening right now in Turkey. You know, President Erdogan, he's been straddling the fence on so many issues, but he has been trying to, on the one hand, broker peace between Russia and NATO, Ukraine. On the other hand, he's working deals with Russia on the transportation of Russian natural gas and oil through Turkey. He's working with Russia on nuclear energy. And yet And yet, he's on the other side of the fence, and he's playing both sides. He's coming up for re-election very soon. And what I'm hearing is the opposition is growing to oust him. You have to believe that it is the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros, who are marshaling these forces against him in order to be able to totally control the foreign policy of Turkey. The earthquake that just happened is devastating for Turkey, not to mention Syria, but Turkey. And whether Erdogan is reelected or not is also going to have to do with how the people in Turkey judge how he deals with this natural disaster that is really unprecedented. So there's a great deal of instability and uncertainty in terms of Turkey, which is a major player in this environment that we are talking about, namely United States, NATO, in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. It's a very serious situation.
True.
Yeah. There's three minor things that we can't touch on today, but we'll use this as a segue, and then we can go to work on China. And that is the arming of Australia to fight as a proxy against China, which is something we can maybe talk about a little later. Then there's this rumor that Poland is preparing to invade Belarus in 9 days, with facing 150,000 fresh Russian forces in Belarus. And the third one is, of course, the huge duh, and we have to mention this, around the revelation, if you will, of that the Nord Stream pipeline was actually blown up by the U.S. What a revelation that Seymour Hersh has here. I appreciate him fleshing out some of the details for us, but we already knew that. But I think it's probably time we start talking about China. Let's who wants to jump in? Billy Bob.
So yeah, Regis, last show he touched on it, but it was at the end of the show, and we didn't really allow him a chance to elaborate. But everybody agrees that China's one of the most important players in the current geopolitics. And there's a divergence of views around the alternate media community that we're forced to engage with because of the mainstream media, sucking so bad. So, Brian Berletic, for instance, will constantly talk about how there's a segment of his viewers that get everything that he's saying about Ukraine and Russia, and they understand that accurately, and they agree with him completely. And yet on China, they're constantly harassing him and telling him that he's just so confused and that he's wrong on China because he supports China, and how he presents them. So there's definitely a divergence of views with regards to how people perceive Russia and China. And it's an important discussion, but I don't want to put any kind of words in Regis' mouth. But I know he has some opinions, and I want to hear those opinions. And I don't think he thinks that China straddles the fence like Erdogan does, right? Like that's a level of fence straddling that I don't think China, in Regis' mind, attains. But maybe a little bit. So Regis, I'm curious. I would like to hear more from you, definitely.
Maybe because you're in Russia, you should start with how people think about China, if you even talk about China in Crimea, in Yalta at all. I wonder what the public attitude is.
Ben, that's a good question. And Billy Bob, I'll come to your question in just a moment. Many Russian people that I've talked to do not trust China. It goes back many, many years. They are afraid that China will eventually totally overcome and dominate them in Russia. There are a lot of Russian people. They're not the young people. The young people are not really in tune with what's going on. They're against the government. They're against corruption. They're behind Navalny. They're just too ignorant and uninformed.
Chinese are behind Navalny? Sorry, that's insane.
Oh,
yeah,
God.
the young people are behind Navalny.
Oh, young Russians. Young Russians, I understand.
Older Russians, no.
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
Anybody born during the Soviet era, they know that he's a laughing fool. He has no respect. He's got less than 1% of the population behind him. But I just mentioned that to say that the Russian people are not concerned. They are concerned about China. They don't trust China, and I think for them they have good reason. However, Vladimir Putin is no fool. He has befriended President Xi of China
in a big way.
They have spoken in person at the Beijing Olympics, where they issued that declaration to the world that the world is changing. It's moving towards a new multipolar world, the strict observance of international law and the UN Charter. I mean, this was a historic declaration, a partnership. I don't think Putin considers himself a minor player in the relationship with China. China may be economically superior, but Russia is recovering economically. We are self-sufficient here. The economy is strong. The military is exceptionally strong. Russia, by many accounts, is 10 to 15 years ahead of the United States in military, weapons, nuclear technology. So this alliance, this partnership between Russia and China is very symbiotic, in my opinion. I do not think that Russia will consider itself a minor player going forward in this effort to create a multipolar world. In fact, it is Vladimir Putin and not Xi that is leading the effort to create a multipolar world. Now, in terms of China, Billy Bob, you asked my opinion on that. I just read today on RT, and a lot of people discredit RT, but there's really good news reporting on RT in English. I have to tell you this. The headline reads, U.S.-China trade is surging as military tensions escalate. What is going on? Now listen to this. The U.S. Bureau of Statistics has reported a record trade turnover between the two countries in excess of $690 billion. Billy Bob, the question is, this is a paradox. What's going on here? On the one hand, the United States is trying to portray China as the new enemy, the real enemy, maybe looking for an off-ramp to get out of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia. But at the same time, the U.S. cannot afford to cut off the umbilical cord, which is the Chinese manufacturing base. Everything that's purchased in America has got a little tab on it that says made in China. So the question we have to ask, Billy Bob, what's really going on here? I mean, can China afford to cut off the United States and the West? So how is China going to play this? It's interesting. Capitalism versus communism or socialism. What many people always say, it's cui bono, it's who profits.
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, right? I mean reality is complicated. There's paradoxes, but you know, I mean what's driving all this is the U.S. losing its unipolar status, right? It's if the status quo remains, China is going to outcompete, and they're going to become the new economic global hegemon. Are we going to take a break, Dustin?
Yes,
Yeah.
It's time for a break. We'll take a brief break. Please subscribe to the channel and enjoy this commercial break. We'll be right back with some more thoughts on the Foreign Policy Review. Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Review and our discussion about China with Regis Tremblay, Billy Bob Ben Toth, and CARLO PARCELLI as co-hosts today. So let's keep back into this discussion. Let's pick up where we left off with Billy Bob's thoughts.
So I was just explaining that it's, you know, the West is losing its preeminence as the unipolar global power. China is its number one rival, to pushing for multipolarism. So I lost my train of thought.
Do you want? I want to frame
derailed.
So in the United States, the paradox is the people that are in charge of the the ruling class running the government, they recognize that if the status quo continues, China is going to be the preeminent power. So they have to figure out a way to weaken and contain China. So Chinese containment. So all the think tanks, all the policy papers talk about the need to contain China, the need to do it quickly, and also how to do it. So that's been going on for at least a decade. The need to contain China and the need to do it soon before China has, broken out and is no longer containable, right? There's a window of opportunity, according to the Western analysis, the planners, that they have to do it quickly. So the problem is China is such a tremendous market. There is such a wealth generating capacity in China that individual self-interested capitalist corporations in the West want to go to China and make money. And they're not going to stop because it's in the benefit of the greater class interest not to go to China. So the ruling class needs to develop a justification for outlawing or criminalizing, economic relations with China. So they need to have a reason to justify sanctions against China and to initiate an economic war with China that is going to be devastating to the U.S. and to China both. This is what all this is about. And so, Russia is a precursor, right? So the West sees a Russian-China alliance as tremendously difficult to their prospects going into the next 100 years, into the rest of the 21st century. They really need to deal with, they can't fight both at once. They want to deal with first Russia, weaken, destabilize Russia, and then they're going to turn their entire attention towards China. So that is seemingly the strategy going on. But I think China is correct to maintain the status quo, suffer Western indignities as long as possible, because it doesn't really hurt. Pelosi visits Taiwan. That doesn't hurt them. Like, they can deal with that. So they want to ride this out for as long as possible, and they're going to be very long suffering because the status quo, they are winning. And it's for the good of the planet to maintain this for as long as possible. So it's up to the West. What is the West going to do? And that remains to be seen. Who is going to prevail as they fight amongst themselves within the Western ruling establishment to develop a policy? Is it going to be the hawks, or is it going to be more rational people? So that's really, I think, still up in the air. Until the hostilities actually begin, there's no telling who's going to win out in the Western ruling class as far as getting to decide policy. But that's just me and my long-winded analysis. Did you have any follow-up commentary, Regis?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with just about everything you said. I will go back to the Clinton era, when the United States offshored our industrial base to China and Mexico. NAFTA was the beginning, and then everybody fled to China. Everybody knows about iPhone, Apple. They know Microsoft. All of the machinery, all of our manufacturing went to China. So what happened during the Obama administration was the quote unquote pivot to Asia to move 60% of American military power to the Pacific, to the South China Sea, all the way down to the Solomon Islands, to Guam, to contain China's expansion. Billy Bob, you're exactly right. That has been American foreign policy since that time, to contain China. Today, the United States has not abandoned that policy. In fact, the United States has doubled, tripled their efforts to contain China's economic expansion, because they perceive it's the greatest threat to them as the world hegemon. On the other hand, Billy Bob, China and Russia have what both Xi and Putin describe as more than an alliance in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the technology sphere, and militarily. Now, you talk about China wanting to maintain the status quo. It has to. And I'll tell you my reason why. The global economy cannot afford to have a complete collapse of the United States dollar and economy. What I believe that Russia and China are trying to do is a soft landing. By that, what I mean is to not destroy the United States economy, its purchasing power, but I think to demilitarize it, to force it to become one among equals in this new world order, this multipolar world, to give up its belief in exceptionalism, the one and only nation, the one that spreads freedom and democracy around the world. I believe this is what China and Russia are fighting on this geopolitical level, is to not destroy the United States of America, but to demilitarize it, and to force it to accept the fact it is no greater and no less than any other country in the world. In other words, one among equals for the benefit of all of humanity. This, I hope this is what is happening in the long range planning in the foreign policy of China and Russia.
I don't know if you know this, it's a tidbit, but the Russian Foreign Ministry's official mission since I think 2008 was saving the world from the United States, way before Ukraine. It already
was. Exactly. Way before Ukraine.
Yep.
That's been all of our mission.
Yeah.
For a lifetime. I wanted to add one other thing to the China discussion. And that is, there was a fairly good article in, of all places, Politico, about Nancy Pelosi's visit to China. And she met with Morris Chang when she was in China, who's the CEO of TSMC, which is the microchip, major microchip producer in the world. And she was talking about the United States has pledged $50 billion to a new domestic microchip initiative. And he was saying things like, well, that's a good start, you know. And there's been no money actually allotted to it yet. That's the way the United States works. They haven't printed it yet. But I mean, in a certain sense, if given the fact that there's a possibility that the U.S. could develop a microchip industry, that would be a threat to this Taiwanese industry and to the TSMC. And so it's in his interest to kind of discourage it and bat it away and make fun of it. If you read the article, you can't really tell whether or not he's actually concerned about this, or there's reason for concern, or if he's genuine and he's genuine about sort of dismissing it. And my knowledge of these people is the dismissing it part is not as powerful as the concern part. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read the article or followed it a little bit, but has anybody got any insight into that?
I thought they were trying to move the chip manufacturing from Taiwan to
the U.S.
Arizona or something.
To Arizona, yeah. And it didn't quite work out. A lot of the Chinese workers said, we are looked down upon. We don't get the same pay as Americans. Fuck that, we're out. So it didn't quite work out. A lot of money changed hands, though.
But that would be good for Taiwan to lose that tremendous asset that would only benefit the U.S. I can't imagine why Taiwan would be totally subservient to the U.S. if they did that. Regis, well, go ahead, Carlo. I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to say, does the military pressure being placed on the region have any role to play in this? And then we could bring in Australia, and we could bring in the South China Sea and that sort of
thing. Well, they're using the pretext of hostilities, you know, to say, hey, let's safeguard your asset and let's take it to the U.S. where it'll be safe. I think that's the pressure that they're trying to leverage in order to get them to relinquish this tremendous asset. But that's my speculation.
Thanks. That's good. I like that.
Regis, I want you to give us some criticism of China. What if you were in charge of China, what would you do differently?
That's a really good question. That's a really good one.
I'm not, but what I would hope is that China would more forcefully become more involved with Russia in the conflict in Ukraine to bring this to a much faster conclusion. And I would hope that that China would do that. I would like to see a much more aligned effort between Russia and China opposed to the United States, the UK, and NATO in Ukraine. I want to point out that the United States now is trying to get NATO involved in the Pacific in the war against China. This is totally insane. It is not what NATO was ever all about. NATO.
I would say it is what NATO was always about. Ask any Serbian, you know. But yeah.
Yeah, well, under the control of the United States, all of its vassals are involved in its effort to subdue the rest of the world. That's for sure. But I think that this foreign policy of the United States is deeply flawed. It is not relying on diplomacy. It's not relying on a win-win belief and philosophy. It is still relying on a zero-sum game where they benefit at the expense of everybody else, and they are still relying on the only thing they have left, and that is military power, threat, and force. Diplomacy for the United States no longer exists anywhere.
Completely.
So we have a question from Shaniqua McAdams.
I think Regis just answered Shaniqua's question. Thank you.
Let me try and answer it too, if possible. So I would just answer Shaniqua by saying that I think, this entire thing is being driven by the West, right? So I think from the very beginning, Russia was happy with peace. They were happy with increased economic ties with Europe. That would have been great for Europe. It would have been great for Russia. Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, cheap gas to Europe and benefit to Russia. A closer ties, peace, mutual prosperity. That's in Russia's interest. Same with China. They have the Belt and Road. They're all about developing the underdeveloped world and win-win, mutual prosperity that leads to peace between the African continent, Central and South America, and just increasing the quality of life of all of humanity. So that's what the status quo was, and that's what was such a threat to the West. And so the West is driving all this. They're driving the destruction of Nord Stream. They're driving the the creation of a noose around China that they're going to tighten at a time of their choosing. So the Russia and China are always interested in peace, and it's really a question of how will the West respond. So Shaniqua, that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, and
so many interesting.
One of the comments from Shaniqua McAdams is: do you believe the U.S. will accept this olive branch from Russia and China, or set the branch in itself on fire? It's my hope, as I've described in this program, that the United States will hopefully recognize its place as one among equals with the rest of the countries in the world. That is our only hope for peace and security in the world going forward.
And to backpedal just a bit, there was Scott Ritter took part in a town hall about a month ago, and it got very, very, there's a lot of shouting going on because
they were NATO people there.
Yeah, you're right. And this one of these idiots from Ukraine, she shouted, "Well, why doesn't Putin just join NATO?" And I wanted to jump into the goddamn television and tell her he tried. You fucking moron! You know something about it.
Carlo, Vladimir Putin, from the day he was elected in, I think it was April of 2000, wanted to become part of Europe, not only part of NATO, but to become a part of Europe. And he was just totally dismissed and laughed at. And for the last 23 years, after repeated attempts to join Russia in a partnership with Europe, it has been undermined by the United States of America. This is one of the greatest fears that the United States has, not just for its hegemonic domination of the world, but for Europe to logically and peacefully join together with Russia in mutual economic, cultural, and political endeavors. This is what I think the people of Europe and the people of Russia want.
Yeah, not since Peter the Great. Not since Peter the Great has there been that kind of exchange.
I think.
Yeah, Ben.
I think this is what Putin and even Medvedev, very, very fond of Europe, wanted. But it died. It died immediately when the Minsk Accords were admitted. I think the Western Europe and Russia are just for 50 years at least. Do you know, Putin apologized to the mothers of the SMO soldiers that he trusted these bastards and their guarantees. I think they've finally noticed, okay, we are done here. And I would like to challenge you. I'm sorry, we always run out of time. On one point that China should get involved militarily, or Iran with the drones, whatever. Russia from day one has made it clear this is our fight. Syrians wanted to come, join, support Russia. A lot of Africans wanted to volunteer. I want to go fight for Russia. And I said, no. You know that the Russian psyche probably better than I do. This is for us. This is our task. Stay out of it. We appreciate the diplomatic support. That you buy our oil, just like India and China does. In the realm of diplomacy, they've got a lot of support from China. China is the big guy in town when it comes to diplomacy. After Lavrov, the best diplomat in the world. But I think they've gotten all the support they need. But military aid, they don't need it. It's obvious now,
Yeah, I agree with you, Ben. Really, really good point.
Ben, since we've discussed it before the show, let's move on to Sudan and what you had to say about Sudan. I think that was interesting.
It has a long history. I looked into it, but what's interesting is, it's been split between North and South based on British imperialism and the way they developed it differently. It's always been poor. But one country after the other in the middle, this is Sub-Sahara in the middle of Africa, they kicked out, the French and invited Wagner in. These are the latest. And Lavrov just did a tour, after President Biden did an African leaders summit last December, and he was just laughed out of the house. Go home. The comments were like, really, go home and don't talk down to us. Fuck off was the message. Lavrov went from place to place, invited, welcomed. We want to do more with you, for you. And the first Russian base is going to be in Sudan. And that's just, neighbor, very, very close to Djibouti, where the one and only Chinese military base is on foreign soil, which, safeguards the open passage between the Mediterranean from Egypt all the way down to the Arab world.
The U.S. leases property from China at that port, that deep water port.
They do
to also establish a military base there, and they now want to establish a new military base on the eastern shore of Sudan, farther north. So they want to build a whole new one. I had a point there, and it went out of my head when So anyway, you're right. I mean, Mali and Burkina Faso are perfectly happy with the Wagner Group and what they accomplished there, and they're so glad that they dispensed with the French. So what does the United States do? It tries to subvert that, and even spills the terrorism into Nigeria, and the Nigerian president began complaining about it. I want to mention one thing before we go. We got about 5 minutes left. Is that in the United States here, we're going to have a march on January 19th. And I really don't know how much credibility the speakers have. I know that in my mind, a number of them have squandered their credibility. Among them, Max Blumenthal and Jimmy Dore, especially they put out these initiatives to get people to go to the march. But they basically scold what they call the left. And if you're not going to the march, you're not on the left. And Max Blumenthal has gone so far as to talk about COVID and attach it to these marches. His take on COVID, which is I guess the pandemic was a fraud. It didn't kill enough people to justify his anecdotal bullshit about playing a virologist on the internet. So he's still working that up. But he made comments about Africa with just utterly outrageous. First of all, he said that you talked about Tanzania. In Tanzania, the president of Tanzania died under suspicious circumstances a few years ago, and he tried to lay it at the feet of Bill Gates and COVID, when in reality there was a whole wealth of reasons to knock off Magufuli, I think his name was, because he was nationalizing all these different industries in Tanzania. So that was the first bullshit thing I heard. But the second one, and this was the most outrageous, is that there are 3 countries in Africa that didn't accept the vaccine. That's Tanzania, Burundi, and Sudan. And so, Ethiopia. I'm sorry. So he said, and the people of Africa didn't get vaccinated even when they had access to the vaccine. And he goes, well, why do you think that is? Well, I'll tell you why I think that is. I mean, it didn't thwart Bill Gates and his money. It's because Africa is the warmest continent on the fucking planet, Max. And COVID is not spread in warmer climates as rapidly it is in colder climates. You fucking moron. So he's gone that far. And and if they keep going that way, they're not going to have any credibility. And I'm going to bring this down to something personal here. My wife and I, we got our 3rd booster. Now we've had 5 shots. Okay, we're there. There's about 10 people working there. We go get our shots, and 8 out of the 10 are African Americans. Now that was a problem with African Americans at first, and they're all nurses and EMTs and administrative people there. So that's a problem because African Americans are dying at a higher rate. Well, there was a campaign on, and that took care of that problem because African Americans got over the Tuskegee Institute, got over the AIDS thing, got over the fact that CIA keeps pumping drugs into their community, and they got the shots. That's why they stopped getting sick. Now, most working people are not MAGA people. That's the vast majority don't have anything to do with MAGA. So if you want to convince those people those good people down there that are getting the shots and are and administering the shots, that you have some credibility, you better shut the fuck up about COVID, because if they hear that about COVID, they're not going to believe you about Ukraine. You're going to sound like an idiot. They're going to go, no. I believe CBS. I believe CSNBC. I believe Fox News.
It's certainly true. This rally has been a contentious issue, very contentious. So that's unfortunate, but there's a whole show's worth of discussion. The other thing is Putin on Monday, I think, is going to give a big, huge speech. It's the 1-year anniversary of the SMO. And I think by next week, Thursday, when we have our show next week, there might be some really, really big news. But Regis, do you have anything to close with about the upcoming Putin speech or the Stop the War rally?
Two things. I hope next week we can do a show immediately after Putin's speech to the Russian parliament and the Russian people. I think it's going to be historic. The second thing I would say is, I think what we are seeing in the Southern Hemisphere, Africa and South America, are realizing that they are done with American colonialism, American exploitation. And they realize that what China and Russia are offering them is not only peace and freedom, but prosperity and sovereignty. All of these things have been denied by the United States of America. They are waking up to this. They are powerful, and they are part of this future coalition that we are going to call the New World Order, a multipolar world.
A fair world order, I think Lavrov called it. I'd just like to add at the end that after Putin's big speech, you should pay attention to the Munich Security Conference, because it was exactly 1 year ago, before the SMO started, where Zelensky was there talking about nukes and NATO. You know, it was very interesting. Biden wasn't there. He sent Kamala. But it will be interesting to see this year's one.
So you're going to come back next week, Regis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I will.
Okay, great.
Thanks for watching the Foreign Policy Review. I'm Dustin Pickering. We had a wonderful discussion. Go back and watch the full program if you missed anything, and be back next week for another full discussion of the Foreign Policy Review. And subscribe to our channel and watch us on Facebook and as well as YouTube. And check out World Linkers Network while you're at it. Do some reading and research, and I hope you have an excellent day. This has been the Foreign Policy Review.
Undoubtedly, Africa is the best tourism destination on Earth. The continent is blessed with the most conducive atmosphere. To feel and enjoy these blessings,